Sometimes the person who changes your life forever walks in soaking wet, drops everything at your feet, and dares you to stop hiding from who you're meant to be. Michael sat in his usual spot at Corner Coffee, the same table by the window where he'd been coming every Tuesday for the past 3 months. His laptop was open in front of him, showing rows and rows of numbers that seemed to blur together after staring at them for so long. The coffee in his white ceramic cup had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't bothered to order a fresh one. The cafe buzzed with its usual afternoon energy. People came and went, their conversations mixing together like background music he'd learned to tune out. The barista called out orders. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled, and somewhere in the corner, a group of college students debated their upcoming exams. It was the perfect kind of noise, loud enough to fill the silence but distant enough that he could pretend to be alone. This had become his routine. Leave the office at exactly 3:30, walk 4 blocks to Corner Coffee, claim his table, and pretend to work until closing time. It wasn't that he enjoyed being here particularly. It was just better than going home to his empty apartment where the silence felt heavy and the walls seemed to close in on him. 6 months ago, his life had been completely different. He'd had someone to come home to, dinner conversations to look forward to, weekend plans that involved more than just grocery shopping and laundry. But that was before the lawyers got involved, before the papers were signed, before he found himself starting over at 34, years old with nothing but a studio, apartment, and a growing collection of takeout menus. Michael shifted in his chair and tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of him. Monthly sales figures, quarterly projections, numbers that used to mean something when he cared about his job, back when success felt important. Now they just looked like tiny black marks on a white screen, keeping his hands busy while his mind wandered to places he didn't want it to go. The couple at the table next to him was sharing a piece of chocolate cake, taking turns feeding each other small bites and laughing at some private joke. Michael found himself watching them out of the corner of his eye, remembering when simple moments like that had been part of his everyday life. The woman tucked her hair behind her ear in a gesture so familiar it made his chest tighten. His ex-wife used to do the same thing. He looked away quickly and took a sip of his cold coffee, making a face at the bitter taste. The barista, a young guy with paint-stained fingers who always seemed to be sketching something during quiet moments, caught his eye and nodded toward the coffee cup with a questioning look. Michael shook his head. He'd learned that accepting kindness from strangers, even something as simple as fresh coffee, felt too much like admitting he needed help. Outside, the afternoon was turning gray. Heavy clouds gathered above the street, and the first few drops of rain began to streak the large windows that faced the sidewalk. People hurried past, pulling jackets tighter around themselves and quickening their pace. Michael felt grateful for the excuse to stay longer. Rain meant he could reasonably avoid going home for another hour or two without seeming pathetic, even to himself. His phone buzzed with a text message. His sister again, probably asking if he wanted to come to dinner this weekend. She'd been doing that a lot lately, ever since the papers were finalized. Well-meaning invitations that felt more like gentle interrogations about his mental health and social life. He loved her for caring, but he wasn't ready for family dinners where everyone would ask how he was doing with carefully concerned expressions. Michael turned the phone face down without reading the message. He'd respond later maybe, or tomorrow. Time had become strangely flexible since his world had narrowed down to work, this coffee shop and his apartment. Days blended together in a comfortable haze of routine that asked nothing of him except that he show up and go through the motions. A mother with 2 small children took the table across from him, and he watched as she tried to juggle coloring books, juice boxes, and what looked like homework while keeping one eye on her kids. The little boy kept dropping his crayons, and each time he bent to pick them up, something else would fall. The mother looked tired but patient, the kind of tired that comes from loving someone more than yourself. Michael remembered being that age, when dropping things was a minor catastrophe that could be fixed with a hug from mom and maybe a cookie, when problems were simple and solutions were even simpler. Before he learned that some things, once broken, couldn't be put back together no matter how carefully you tried to match the pieces. He closed the laptop with a soft click. The numbers weren't getting any more interesting, and he'd already stretched this coffee shop visit as long as reasonably possible. Outside, the rain was coming down harder now, creating rivers along the sidewalk and sending people running for cover. He could wait it out, order that fresh coffee, maybe stay until the evening crowd replaced the afternoon regulars. The bell above the entrance chimed as someone pushed through the door, bringing a gust of cool, rain-scented air into the warm cafe. Michael glanced up automatically, then looked back down at his closed laptop. In the months he'd been coming here, he'd perfected the art of being present but not engaged, visible but not available. It was safer that way. Eye contact led to conversations, conversations led to connections, and connections led to the kind of complications he wasn't ready to handle. He gathered his things slowly, in no hurry to leave but knowing he couldn't stay forever. The couple with the chocolate cake had finished their dessert and were holding hands across the small table, talking quietly about something that made them both smile. The mother had successfully contained her children's art supplies and was reading them a story in hushed tones. Even the college students had settled into focused studying, their earlier debate replaced by the comfortable silence of shared concentration. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere, to someone. Everyone except Michael, who had become an expert at existing in the spaces between other people's lives, close enough to feel normal, but far enough away to avoid getting hurt again. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was predictable, and predictable felt safe in a way that hope and possibility no longer did. The rain continued to fall outside, and Michael decided he could stay just a little longer. After all, what was the rush? His empty apartment would still be empty whether he got there at 5 o'clock or 7, and the silence would wait patiently for his return, just as it always did. The door burst open with such force that the little bell above it rang out like an alarm clock breaking through a peaceful dream. Michael looked up despite himself, his carefully practiced habit of avoiding eye contact forgotten in the sudden commotion. The woman who entered looked like she'd been fighting with the storm outside and had somehow managed to win. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, rainwater dripping steadily onto the wooden floor beneath her feet. Her jacket, a bright red that seemed to glow against the muted colors of the coffee shop, hung heavy with water. But what struck Michael most wasn't how soaked she was, or how she seemed completely unbothered by the small puddle forming around her shoes. It was the way she moved with absolute purpose, like she owned every space she entered. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room with intense focus. Her eyes moved from table to table, person to person, as if she was looking for something specific, or someone. The usual chatter in the cafe had died down slightly, the way it does when something unexpected happens and people aren't sure whether to stare or politely look away. Michael found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't say why. There was something electric about her presence, something that made the air feel charged like it does right before lightning strikes. She took a step forward, then another, and that's when everything went wrong. Or maybe everything went right. Later, he would never be quite sure which. Her phone slipped from her wet fingers first. It hit the floor with a sharp crack that made everyone in the nearby tables wince. Then, as if that was just the beginning of some elaborate chain reaction, her purse followed. The zipper must have been open because everything inside scattered across the floor like confetti at a celebration nobody had planned. Papers fluttered down like autumn leaves, some landing on tables, others sliding under chairs. Pens rolled in different directions, each one seeming to have its own destination in mind. Her keys landed with a metallic clatter right next to Michael's table, close enough that he could have reached down and picked them up without even standing. The normal thing would have been for her to immediately drop to her knees, frantically gathering her belongings while muttering apologies to everyone around her. That's what most people would do. That's what Michael would have done if he ever carried a purse and found himself in such a situation. But she didn't do the normal thing. Instead, she straightened up slowly, water still dripping from her hair and jacket. She looked around the room once more, but this time her gaze was different. It wasn't searching anymore. It was challenging, like she was daring anyone to make her feel embarrassed about what had just happened. And then her eyes found his. Michael felt something shift inside his chest, like a door he'd forgotten existed suddenly creaking open. Her gaze was direct and unwavering, holding his with an intensity that made him forget about everything else in the room. The couple with their chocolate cake, the mother with her children, the college students, the barista with paint on his fingers. They all faded into the background as if someone had turned down the volume on the rest of the world. She wasn't beautiful in the magazine-perfect way that made men stumble over their words. Her nose was a little too sharp, her chin a little too stubborn, and right now her hair looked like she'd stuck her finger in an electrical socket. But there was something magnetic about her, something that pulled at him in a way he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten the sensation was possible. Her lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile, and Michael realized she was waiting, not for him to help her pick up her things, though her belongings were still scattered around both their feet like evidence of some beautiful disaster. She was waiting to see what kind of person he was. Would he be the type to jump up immediately, all helpful and concerned? Would he pretend nothing had happened and go back to staring at his laptop screen? Or would he surprise both of them with something else entirely? The seconds stretched between them like a bridge neither of them had decided whether to cross. Michael could feel his heart beating faster, though he couldn't understand why. This was just a stranger who had dropped her things in a coffee shop. It happened every day, somewhere in the world. There was nothing special about this moment. Nothing that should have made him feel like the carefully constructed walls around his life were suddenly made of glass instead of brick. But as he looked into her eyes, still holding that steady gaze that seemed to see right through all his defenses, Michael realized that some moments don't ask for permission before they change everything. Some moments just arrive uninvited and unexpected, dropping their belongings at your feet and looking straight into your soul as if they have every right to be there. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside Corner Coffee, time seemed to have stopped altogether. Her phone lay cracked on the floor between them, papers scattered like fallen stars, keys glinting in the afternoon light, and still neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. Neither of them seemed willing to be the first to break whatever spell had settled over their corner of the world. Michael closed his laptop without looking at it. The sound of it snapping shut somehow loud in the strange quiet that had fallen around them. It was a small action, but it felt enormous, like closing one chapter of his life and getting ready to see what might be written on the first page of the next. "You're going to just sit there, aren't you?" Her voice cut through the silence with the warmth of someone who found the whole situation genuinely amusing, rather than frustrating. There was a slight accent there, something Michael couldn't quite place, and a tone that suggested this wasn't really a question at all. She already knew the answer. Michael surprised himself by almost smiling. "I was wondering if you were planning to pick any of that up," he replied, gesturing toward the chaos of papers and pens still decorating the floor around them. It was the first honest thing he'd said to a stranger in months, and it felt strange coming out of his mouth, like speaking a language he'd once known fluently, but had forgotten from lack of practice. She laughed then, and the sound was nothing like the polite chuckles he'd gotten used to hearing in business meetings or the forced cheerfulness of small talk with cashiers. This was real laughter, the kind that started in her belly and worked its way up until it lit up her whole face. It was infectious in the way that genuine happiness always is, and Michael felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized had been tight. "I'm Maya," she said, extending her hand while completely ignoring the fact that her entire life was currently spread across the coffee shop floor. "And you're the man who sits in this exact spot every Tuesday afternoon, typing things that make you look like you're carrying the weight of the entire universe on your shoulders." The accuracy of her observation should have made him uncomfortable. It should have sent him reaching for his jacket and heading for the door, back to the safety of his apartment where nobody could see him clearly enough to make such statements. Instead, Michael found himself genuinely curious about how she'd noticed his routine, and more importantly, why she'd been paying attention. "Michael," he said, taking her offered hand. Her grip was firm and warm, and she held on just a moment longer than necessary, as if she was making sure he was real. "And I didn't know I was that obvious." "Everyone's obvious if you know how to look," Maya said, finally kneeling down to start gathering her scattered belongings. Michael joined her without really deciding to, his body moving before his brain had time to talk him out of it. As they worked together, their hands occasionally brushing when they reached for the same pen or piece of paper, she continued talking in that easy way that made conversation feel effortless. "I work at the community center 3 blocks over," she said, stuffing papers back into her purse without much concern for organization. "I see you through the window when I walk by. Same table, same laptop, same expression like you're trying to solve world hunger with a spreadsheet." Michael handed her a pen that had rolled under his chair. "Maybe I'm trying to solve world hunger," he said, then immediately wondered where that had come from. When had he started making jokes with strangers? When had talking to new people stopped feeling like walking through a minefield? "Are you?" Maya asked, looking genuinely interested as she retrieved her cracked phone and winced at the spiderweb of lines across its screen. "No," Michael admitted. "Just quarterly sales reports. Significantly less noble, but probably more profitable," she said with another one of those infectious grins. "What kind of sales?" And somehow, before Michael knew what was happening, he found himself actually talking, not the careful surface-level conversation he'd perfected for work situations or family gatherings, but real talking. About his job at the marketing firm, about how he'd started coming to this coffee shop because it was close to the office but stayed because it felt safer than going home, about how spreadsheets had become his escape from thinking about anything more complicated than numbers and formulas. Maya listened with the kind of attention that made him feel like what he was saying actually mattered. She didn't interrupt or offer unwanted advice or give him those sympathetic looks that made him feel like a project someone needed to fix. She just listened, occasionally asking questions that showed she was really hearing him, really trying to understand. "What about you?" Michael asked as they both stood up, her belongings finally collected if not exactly organized. "What do you do at the community center that's important enough to make you run through rainstorms?" Maya's face lit up in a way that made it clear he'd asked exactly the right question. "I work with teenagers," she said, and there was so much pride in her voice that Michael found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by her obvious passion. "Kids who've been told they're too much trouble, too angry, too broken to succeed. I help them figure out that being different isn't the same thing as being wrong." She talked about the after-school program she'd started, about teaching kids to channel their frustration into art and music and writing, instead of the destructive outlets that had been their only options before. She mentioned the girl who'd never spoken in class but wrote poetry that could make grown adults cry, the boy who'd been labeled a troublemaker but turned out to have an incredible talent for organizing community events. "They remind me of myself," Maya said, and there was something in her voice that suggested stories she wasn't ready to tell yet, experiences that had shaped her in ways that made her particularly good at seeing potential in places other people saw only problems, fierce and stubborn and absolutely determined to prove that they matter. Michael realized he'd been smiling for several minutes straight, something that hadn't happened in so long it almost made his cheeks hurt. There was something about the way Maya talked about her work, about the kids she helped, about the small victories and daily challenges, that made him remember what it felt like to care about something, beyond just getting through each day. "That sounds amazing," he said, and meant it completely. "It is," Maya replied, then tilted her head slightly as she looked at him. "You know what I noticed about you that first day I saw you through the window?" Michael shook his head, not sure he wanted to hear the answer but unable to stop himself from asking anyway. "You looked like someone who'd forgotten he was still alive," she said gently. "Like you were so focused on just surviving each day that you'd stopped noticing there was anything worth living for." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they were true. Maya had seen in 5 minutes what he'd been carefully hiding from himself for months. 3 weeks later, Michael realized his life had become completely unrecognizable. Maya had somehow inserted herself into his carefully ordered world, and instead of the chaos he'd expected, she'd brought something he'd forgotten existed. Unpredictability that felt exciting rather than terrifying. She didn't just meet him at corner coffee anymore. She showed up at his office building during lunch breaks with sandwiches from a deli she'd discovered, claiming he looked too thin and that spreadsheets weren't proper nutrition. She invited herself to his apartment one evening when he'd mentioned he was ordering pizza again, arriving with grocery bags full of ingredients and a determination to teach him that cooking didn't have to be complicated to be good. "You know what your problem is?" Maya said one Thursday night as they sat in his kitchen, sharing takeout containers of Thai food, because her cooking lesson had been temporarily abandoned when they'd gotten distracted talking about her day at the community center. The apartment that had felt like a tomb for months now felt warm and lived in, filled with the sound of another person's laughter. Michael looked around his kitchen, taking in the evidence of Maya's presence, her jacket draped over the back of a chair, her shoes kicked off by the door, a book she was reading left open on his counter. Small things, but they transformed the space in ways he couldn't have imagined. "Just one problem?" he asked, attempting humor but genuinely curious about her answer. You've been so busy protecting yourself from getting hurt again that you forgot the difference between being safe and being alive, she said, twirling noodles around her fork with the casual confidence of someone who said exactly what they thought. There's a whole world happening around you, and you've been watching it through bulletproof glass. The observation was vintage Maya, direct, accurate, and delivered with enough warmth to take the sting out of the truth. Over the past few weeks, she'd developed an uncanny ability to see straight through his defenses to the parts of himself he'd been trying to keep hidden. It should have made him uncomfortable, but instead it felt like relief. "Tell me about her," Maya said suddenly, setting down her fork and giving him that steady look that meant she wasn't going to let him change the subject or deflect with humor. Michael felt his stomach tighten. They'd danced around the topic of his marriage for weeks, Maya respecting his obvious reluctance to discuss it, while still making it clear she was ready to listen whenever he was ready to talk. But tonight, something in her voice told him she wasn't going to let him avoid it anymore. "There's not much to tell," he started, then caught the look in Maya's eyes and realized she wasn't going to accept that kind of non-answer. He took a deep breath and tried again. "Her name was Jennifer. We were together for 8 years, married for 5. We met in college, did everything the way you're supposed to do it. Dated, moved in together, got engaged, had the wedding, bought the house." Maya waited, not pushing but not letting him off the hook either. The silence stretched between them, until Michael found himself continuing, words spilling out that he hadn't spoken to anyone, not even his sister. "The thing is, we didn't fall apart dramatically," he said, staring at his hands wrapped around his water glass. "There was no big fight, no betrayal, no moment where everything went wrong. We just grew apart so slowly that neither of us noticed, until we were basically strangers living in the same house. We'd have dinner together and not have anything to say. We'd watch movies and I'd realize I had no idea what she was thinking. We became roommates who happened to share a last name." Maya reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm, her touch gentle but firm. "That sounds harder than a dramatic ending," she said quietly. "At least with a big fight, you get to be angry. This sounds like it just hurt." The understanding in her voice almost undid him. For months, he'd been carrying around the weight of a failed marriage, convinced that if he'd just tried harder, paid more attention, been a better husband, things would have worked out differently. But Maya's simple acknowledgement that sometimes relationships just fade away, despite everyone's best intentions, felt like permission to stop blaming himself. "I keep thinking I should have seen it coming," Michael said, surprised by how easy it was to tell her things he'd never been able to put into words before. Like there should have been warning signs, moments where I could have done something different. But it was so gradual. One day we were happy, and then suddenly we weren't, and I couldn't figure out when the change had happened. "Maybe that's not your fault," Maya said, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of his hand. "Maybe some things just run their course, and trying to force them to last longer only makes everyone miserable." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the Thai food growing cold between them as Michael processed the relief of finally talking about the end of his marriage with someone who didn't try to offer solutions or assign blame. Maya just listened, holding space for his pain without trying to fix it. "You know what the worst part was?" Michael said eventually, surprised to find himself still talking. "The loneliness. Not just after the divorce, but during the marriage. Being lonely when you're supposed to be with your person, when you're sharing a bed and a mortgage and a life, but feeling like you're completely alone anyway. That's a special kind of awful." Maya nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. "Is that why you picked corner coffee? Because being alone in a crowd feels less lonely than being alone in an empty apartment?" The accuracy of her insight made Michael laugh, though it came out a little shaky. "You're terrifying, you know that? How do you see things so clearly?" "Practice," Maya said simply. "When you work with kids who've been hurt, you learn to recognize when someone's building walls to keep the pain out. The thing about walls, though, is they're not selective. They keep out the bad stuff, sure, but they also keep out everything good." Michael looked at her sitting across from him in his kitchen, her hair still slightly messy from the wind outside, her eyes bright with intelligence and compassion, and realized she was right. For months, he'd been so focused on avoiding another heartbreak that he'd stopped allowing himself to feel anything at all. But Maya had somehow slipped past his defenses, bringing warmth and laughter and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk to try again. "What if I mess this up too?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Maya smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made him feel like everything might actually be okay. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "But you can't mess up something you never try." 6 months after that rainy Tuesday when Maya had burst through the coffee shop door and turned his world upside down, Michael found himself standing in corner coffee once again. But this time everything was different. The same worn wooden tables, the same hum of conversation, the same barista with paint on his fingers. But Michael barely recognized the man who used to hide in the corner booth, afraid to make eye contact with anyone who might ask him to engage with life. Maya had left for Seattle 3 weeks ago. A job offer she couldn't refuse at a nonprofit that worked with homeless youth, the kind of opportunity she'd been dreaming about for years. They'd talked about him coming with her, about what it might mean to pack up his life and start over in a new city with someone who'd taught him how to live again. But Michael had hesitated, and not for the reasons he might have expected. Not from fear of commitment or terror of getting hurt again, but from a newfound understanding that the choice to be open, to be vulnerable, to engage fully with life, had to come from inside him. It couldn't depend on Maya's presence or anyone else's. It had to be something he chose for himself again and again every single day. The letter in his jacket pocket had taken him 4 tries to write. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he'd kept trying to make it perfect, to find words that could capture everything Maya had given him. In the end, he'd settled for simple honesty, the kind she'd always appreciated most. "Dear Maya," it began, "you were right about the walls. You were right about a lot of things. But mostly you were right that I had to choose to be alive instead of just surviving. I'm choosing every day now, and I wanted you to know that whether you're in Seattle or on the moon, I'm going to keep choosing. Thank you for showing me the difference." Michael had sealed the letter that morning, addressed it to her new apartment in Seattle, and tucked it into his pocket. He'd mail it on his way home after his coffee, after he did the thing that had become his new Tuesday tradition. The door chimed and Michael looked up automatically, a habit he'd developed over the past few months. It wasn't Maya. He knew it wouldn't be. But it was a young woman about his age, struggling with an oversized portfolio case and a coffee cup that was clearly too full for someone trying to navigate a crowded coffee shop. 6 months ago, Michael would have watched her struggle and done nothing, too wrapped up in his own isolation to notice when someone needed help. But Maya had taught him something valuable, that small acts of kindness weren't just good for the people you helped, they were good for your soul. They connected you to the world in ways that made life feel meaningful instead of just manageable. Michael stood up, closed his laptop, the same laptop that used to be his shield against human connection, and walked over to the woman. "Can I help you with that?" he asked, gesturing toward her portfolio case as she tried to balance it against her hip while fishing for her wallet. She looked up at him with relief and gratitude. "That would be amazing, thank you. I'm an illustrator, and this thing weighs about 50 pounds. I keep telling myself I need a rolling case, but..." She shrugged, the universal gesture of someone whose best intentions kept getting derailed by real life. "But they're expensive, and you keep thinking you can manage." Michael finished with a smile, taking the portfolio case from her. "I'm Michael." "Rachel," she said, finally able to get her wallet out and pay for her coffee. "Are you an artist too?" "You have that look." Michael laughed, thinking about his spreadsheets and quarterly reports. "No, just someone who's learned that carrying heavy things is easier when you don't do it alone." They talked for a few minutes while Rachel organized her things, and Michael helped her find a table near the outlet she needed for her laptop. She was working on illustrations for a children's book, something about a dragon who was afraid of heights, and her enthusiasm for the project reminded him of the way Maya used to light up when she talked about her kids at the community center. When Rachel was settled and no longer needed his help, Michael returned to his table. But instead of reopening his laptop and disappearing back into his work, he looked around the coffee shop with new eyes. The mother with 2 children was back, and this time when her son dropped his crayons, Michael was there to help pick them up, engaging the little boy in a conversation about his artwork that made both the child and his mother smile. The barista with paint on his fingers was taking a break, sketching in a notebook. and Michael found himself curious about the drawing. It turned out to be a portrait of the coffee shop's regular customers, and Michael was surprised to discover he was in it, not hiding behind his laptop as he'd been for months, but looking up and engaged, the way he'd apparently been looking since Maya had entered his life. "You've changed," the barista said simply when Michael commented on the drawing. "You used to sit in that corner like you were trying to disappear. Now you look like you're actually here." The observation hit Michael with unexpected force. He had changed fundamentally and completely. Maya had shown him the difference between existing and living, between surviving and thriving, between hiding from life and embracing it with all its messy, complicated, beautiful possibilities. As the afternoon wore on, Michael found himself in conversations with people he'd been sharing space with for months but had never really seen. The college students working on a group project invited him to settle a debate about marketing strategies for their business plan. An elderly man reading alone at a corner table turned out to be a retired teacher, with fascinating stories about how education had changed over his 40-year career. By the time evening fell and the coffee shop began to empty out, Michael realized he'd spent the entire afternoon engaged with the world around him. Not because he was trying to fill a void left by Maya's absence, but because he genuinely enjoyed connecting with other people, hearing their stories, sharing small moments of human warmth. The letter to Maya felt heavier in his pocket, but in a good way, like a promise he was making not just to her, but to himself. He'd learned that love wasn't just about finding the right person. It was about becoming the kind of person who could love fully, openly, without guarantees or safety nets. As Michael packed up his laptop and prepared to leave Corner Coffee, he caught his reflection in the rain-streaked window. The man looking back at him was someone he recognized but hadn't seen in a long time, someone who was fully present in his own life, ready to meet whatever came next with open eyes and an open heart. He pulled out his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, typed a quick text to his sister. "Yes to dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up." Then he walked out into the Seattle evening, Maya's letter in his pocket and a smile on his face, ready to mail it and continue the life she'd helped him remember he wanted to live.